Today we're looking at some of the tricks that the forces of the Machine God can bring to bear with 6 scary Admech units in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video I'm going to talk a bit about some of the strongest units in the Admech Codex, at least as I see them, roughly what they do and why I think that they're so good at the moment. Hopefully it might provide a little bit of inspiration to Admech players and a bit more information to anyone who are fighting up against the forces of the Mechanicus. There are a lot of interesting options in the Codex, so I'm not saying that these are the only strong options there, but they're some of the ones that I find the most interesting. Without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So first up I thought we'd talk about Kataphron Breachers. These guys were really quite powerful in 8th edition, and I feel they're one of the units that have transitioned to 9th really quite well. Both Breachers and Destroyers I think have multiple decent ways to field them, but the one that I really wanted to focus on this time were the Arc Rifle and Arc Claw Breachers that cost 35 points a model, and you can get a really nice combo with them in the Data Horde Forge world. Breachers are decently tough at this point level. They're toughness 5, 3 wounds and a 3+ save and a 6+ invul, and as their troops they do have objectives secured, and tough troops with Obsec do seem to have a pretty decent place in 9th edition objective scoring. They manage this while having really quite decent offensive output as well. Those heavy arc rifles are heavy 2-shot, 36 inches, strength 6, AP -2 and damage D3, but it goes up to a whopping damage D6 versus vehicles. It's quite a good all-round general purpose gun, but if you run them in the Data Horde Forge world, then you get extra hits with any arc weapons that you use every time that you roll a 5 or 6. These guys typically only hit on 4s to start with, so we're kind of getting an extra 60% of extra shots out of the unit, and it's just an absolutely ludicrous buff to their firepower. Good range and basically being effective against any single target that you point them at is a really good combo, and they're kind of perfect for just rolling up onto objectives and just blazing away at the enemy all game long. If they do get threatened, they're not even too bad in close combat. Those arc claws give them an extra pip of strength and AP, D3 damage, and they also get the extra exploding 5s and 6s as per the Data Horde Forge world. They're not enormously fast, and they certainly aren't the biggest damage dealers in the Admech decks, but being very durable and able to operate independently outside character buffs are really good things going for them. I think they're good battle line units, and I've seen plenty of people writing Admech lists that have an Introducere and 3 units of 3 of these guys just to operate as a durable battle line and support a main Admech army advance. There are plenty of other combos that you can use with Kataphrons, such as having big units of them to make use of +1 to hit when they're next to Castellan robots with a stratagem, or +1 to their saves. Never mind the very scary Rise of Plasma Destroyers. In general I think they're just a very strong unit, and there's plenty of ways that you can go with them. Next up we have Ironstrider Balistarii, who I think have really come into their own since the Engine War release. Both versions are decent, but I seem to see more people running the autocannon ones than the las cannons. Basically a way to make this a pretty much anti-everything firepower unit is running them in squads of 5 in the Mars Forge world, and stand them next to any buffing characters that you have around, such as Cawl for example. Mars has a unique canticle of the Omnicide to make those autocannons to the all-important strength 8. They have a specific stratagem for Ironstriders that can give them +1 to wound, so basically anything toughness 7 or below they're going to be wounding on 2s. And then to get an absolute bunch of mortal wounds on the go, you can combine that with Wrath of Mars, which means that you get mortal wounds on 6s, but because you have +1 to wound, you can get mortal wounds on 5s and 6s with them. A unit of 5 of these throwing out 20 shots with both of those stratagems active should do around 16 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles. And that's before you add any character buffs whatsoever into the equation, and Admech has some good ones, as we'll see in a second. On top of this they're also reasonably fast, so can get good lines of sight, and they're at least fairly reasonable durability point for point. The unit of 5 would cost you 330 points, but that does get you 30 wounds of Ironstrider on the table. Next up I wanted to talk about Fulgurite Electro Priests, where the way to go for them at the moment seems to be having them hopping out of the Scorpius Dunerider. These guys seem to be winning out as the preferred melee beatstick for the Admech Codex. It's not really hard to see why. They have 2 attacks each at strength 5, AP -2 and damage D3, plus they get mortal wounds on 6s, and also the chance to inflict further mortal wounds on the charge. If and when they manage to kill an enemy unit, which isn't that unlikely to be honest with those stats, they'll then gain a 3+ invul save, and with a 5+ feel no pain it can make the unit really hard to shift. I'll admit they're not the cheapest included in an army, at 270 points once you've bought the Scorpius transport for them, but they are kind of a melee threat the opponent can't really ignore, and they're quite frequently run as Styges in Admech, due to the pre-game movement stratagem that the transport can use, which if your opponent deploys aggressively, then it means that you could potentially get a first turn charge, the Dunerider moves up pre-game, the priests get out turn 1, and that should be able to put them within a 12-inch charge range of the enemy's front line. Not too bad for the opponent to be fighting for his unit's lives and also his objectives right from the get-go. Talking from objectives, if you use the acquisition at any cost stratagem, they can potentially get a 2+ invul save if they're next to an objective and they've also killed a unit. Unless your opponent has absolutely masses of anti-infantry fire or mortal wounds, then that unit won't be going anywhere fast. Talking of board control and pushing up into your opponent's face, the Admech really have a pretty excellent option for this in the Serberys Raiders. These guys are 16 points per model, and they often seem to be used in units of 3 to 5 for very cheap sniping skirmish cavalry. Point per points and point per wound, they're really fairly tough. They have 3 wounds apiece, so even a unit of 3 will take a little bit of firepower to get rid of. These guys have a pre-game move built into them, they don't have to use stratagems or anything, so basically you can move up and take control of the front of the board right from turn 1, and it can be really annoying in terms of move blocking and screening to prevent enemy units getting too close to the Admech Firebase. I'd say their primary purpose is taking board control and screening out enemy units, but they do have some damage potential as well. They have some melee threat against light infantry with those cavalry sabres and the clawed limbs of their mounts, and also their galvanic rifles and pistols can target characters freely. Could potentially be enough to pick off some support characters, maybe supported by some transuranic arquebuses back from the back line. They can also be incredibly frustrating to deal with if your opponent needs to deal with them in melee. They have a stratagem called Tactica Obliqua, which can pretty easily leave an enemy melee unit completely floundering. Even if they're charged from right next to them, they can pop that stratagem and essentially allows them to run away a full amount of movement before the enemy gets to make their charge move. With a good 12-inch movement, in general it should theoretically be possible to make the charge completely impossible. After that, in your turn, they could potentially move straight back up into the opponent's faces, maybe shoot them, maybe even charge them themselves if they want to. Honestly, just having these guys on the table is generally going to be a positive for the Admech player. They can cause a lot of frustration and gain a lot of board control, and even if the opponent does shoot them down first, that means they're not shooting your other more threatening units. Next up, I've kind of cheated a bit and included 2 units rather than 1, but I just wanted to mention the excellent Firebase combo of Belisarius Cawl's rerolls and also a Holy Order Warlord trait Introducere with the divinations of the Magos. This is one of the better combos in the whole game of 40k at the moment in terms of overlapping auras buffing shooting weapons. Cawl basically gives full Chapter Master style rerolls, which you can potentially get to a whole 9-inch range if you take his Warlord trait with a stratagem, and he can also provide a little bit of repairs, shooting and melee threat. The Introducere has to be your actual Warlord and have the divinations of the Magos Holy Order Warlord trait, which basically gives you exploding 6s when shooting, so every time you roll an unmodified 6 to hit, and you essentially get 2 hits out of that. On top of that, if you're using Cawl, then you're from the Mars Forge world, so you can potentially stack it with the Mars' Cant Core for +1 heavy weapon strength, and you could even combine the whole thing with Daedalus, giving 1 unit +1 to hit if they hit on 4s for example. The combined percentage modifier is really quite potent. You get +66% damage increase for ballistic skill 3+ units, such as the Scorpius tanks or Oneida Dunecrawlers. It actually effectively doubles the damage output of any ballistic skill 4+ units, such as Kataphron Battle Servitors or Castellan Robots. This pair is basically a good reason why the Admech shooting phase is arguably one of the stronger ones in the game at the moment. They basically work well with any of the decent fire support units the Adeptus Mechanicus have, whether that's Castellan Robots with their loads of shots that you can also use Wrath of Mars on, Kataphron Servitors of all stripes, Oneida Dunecrawlers, particularly with Icarus arrays, the Ironstriders we've already mentioned, Scorpius tanks both with Ferromite or the Belarus energy cannons for targeting stuff out of line of sight, or even potentially Archaeopter Stratoraptors before they maybe go off and hunt down isolated enemy units. Most of these units are strong in their own right, though mostly fairly simple shooting platforms that didn't need too much explanation I thought. Basically you can choose the sort of firepower that you most want to have amplified and put it around Cawl on this Magos. Finally, I wanted to focus on the Archaeopter Fusilave, the bomber variant of the new Batwind flyer that came out alongside Engine War. This guy costs 130 points, or 150 if you take a chaff launcher along for him, the one that reduces incoming damage by 1 and makes him a lot more survivable. This guy's armed with 4 heavy stubbers, so can provide a little bit of anti-infantry firepower as he flies around, and it can pack a bit more punch than expected, particularly if you are using that Mars +1 to strength for heavy weapons bonus. More of his damage output comes from this bomb that he can drop each turn though. If he moves over an enemy unit, then he can basically roll up to 10 dice for the number of models in the unit, and for each roll of a 4+, they take a mortal wound. It will be some pretty reliable damage per turn, perhaps best employed against elite 1 wound infantry units. All this is pretty decent, and he can be a bit of a menace jumping around the opponent's backline with his excellent movement, but on top of that he has 3 really disruptive little stratagems that could make him a real pain for the opponent to have to deal with. First of all, he can drop a seismic bomb, which he can do on top of his regular bomb in the same turn. This gives you a slowing type effect on one unit, so it's pretty good to put on some enemy Death Star. If he targets a unit with it, then it halves its move, halves its advance, and halves its charge roll. Could be the difference between whether or not a melee unit actually makes it to your lines or not the following turn. Secondly, he has electrofilament countermeasures like all the Archaeopters. This one provides a 6-inch aura bubble of no enemy auras working whatsoever. So if he can land somewhere anywhere near a Space Marine castle, for example, then he could seriously mess with the overlapping character buffs of things like Chapter Masters and Lieutenants. His base is pretty enormous as well. That could cover a lot of the table where their characters wouldn't function, so throwing him straight down the middle towards enemy lines might not be the worst idea. Theoretically, most characters will be able to move out of range of this aura disruption, but they might not necessarily want to, as it might mean going backwards into their own lines, for example, which generally characters won't want to do, so it could be very problematic in the right scenario. Doubling down on the idea of just putting him as forward into enemy lines as possible, all Admech units have the Machine Spirit Revenge stratagem, which allows them to auto-explode when they die. So if the opponent just clusters up and moves around the flyer while killing it on the way, then you could shower them with a whole bunch of mortal wounds. Again, potentially quite a wide area, with its very big base. Again, much like the Serberys Raiders, I think having 1 or 2 Fusilaves about would be a very big nuisance to the enemy army. They'll chip away with a bit of damage each turn, could be very hard to remove with the chaff launcher, and have the potential to thoroughly screw with battle plans and movement things if you either want to get out of range of them, either because of the aura buff or the chance for them to auto-explode. So I hope you liked the quick rundown of the Admech units in 9th edition. If you've had any experience playing with or against any of these, then any insights will be massively appreciated down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll have plenty more coming out similar to this. And if you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming, then I do have a Patreon link which is down in the video description below. The channel's Patreon being what allows me to spend quite so much time making tactics videos about Warhammer 40k. Channel patrons get access to a new video each week early. There's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and also you get automatic entry into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway, which happens once a month, where we give away some big kits. This month we're posting out 4 copies of the Start Collecting Vanguard Space Marines kit, and there's new stuff going out each month. If any of that sounds interesting, or you'd just like to help support the channel and keep the videos coming, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.